Introduction. The snow fell thick over Sverdlovsk Oblast in the winter of 2002. Inside a narrow apartment on the edge of a decaying panel block district, an elderly woman named Anna Petrovna Sorokina opened her door to a stranger. She was 76 years old. She had survived Stalin's purges, 2 husbands, and 4 decades of Soviet rationing. She had outlasted most of the people she had ever loved. The woman at the threshold carried a folder and spoke with the tired patience of a social worker. Anna Petrovna had learned to trust people who carried folders. Officials carried folders. Officials meant business that needed attending. She let her in. 2 hours later, the body was found on the kitchen floor. The purse was gone. The cloth was gone. The pension envelope was gone. The only witness was the silence of the stairwell and the faint smell of boiled cabbage that had nowhere else to go. The faint smell of boiled cabbage that had nowhere else to go. Irina Viktorovna Gaidamachuk was 42 years old, an alcoholic living in a one-room flat with her teenage daughter. She needed money for vodka. She had discovered, somewhere between her first drink and her last coherent thought about the future, that old women living alone rarely fought back, that their pensions arrived on predictable dates, that they had been taught by 70 years of Soviet bureaucracy to open their doors to anyone who looked official enough. She had found a folder, she had found an axe, she had found a system. Over the next 8 years, she would be linked to 17 confirmed killings. This she wanted to talk aboard. The official count stopped at 17 because the archives stopped looking. This is not a story about a monster who appeared from nowhere. Monsters do not appear from nowhere. They grow in rooms that smell of cheap liquor and desperation, in systems that file reports and never read them again, in the spaces between one district's jurisdiction and the next. This is a record of doors that opened, of reports that were filed and forgotten, of a bureaucracy still learning how to count its dead after the Soviet Union collapsed and left behind nothing but the ledgers. The doors kept opening because no one was watching who knocked. 17 women opened their doors. Not one of them came back from that decision. Subscribe to Archive 13 and tell us in the comments how many pension books were emptied before the first detective asked why the victims all looked the same. Anna Petrovna Sorokina's apartment smelled of boiled cabbage and old wool and the particular staleness of rooms where the windows have not been opened since October. She was 76 years old. She had a photograph of her late husband on the windowsill and a cloth purse hidden behind the flour tin. Her pension had arrived the day before. She had not yet been to the post office to deposit it because her hip had been troubling her, and the steps outside were iced over. When the knock came, she moved slowly to the peephole. She saw a woman in a dark coat holding a folder. The woman looked tired and official and cold. Anna Petrovna turned the lock. The woman who entered gave her name as Irina. She said she was from the district housing authority. She asked about heating subsidies, about whether the radiators were functioning, about whether Anna Petrovna had registered for the Elderly Assistance Program. The questions were plausible. The language was correct. The folder contained actual papers, shuffled with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed the routine enough times to make it feel real. They spoke for approximately 20 minutes. The tea was offered. It may have been accepted. The archives do not record the small rituals, only the outcome. Then Irina stood, reached into her bag, and swung a small axe once across the back of the skull. The blow was not clean. Anna Petrovna fell forward and struck the table edge. The second blow landed behind the ear. She did not make a sound that carried through the walls. Irina took the cloth purse from behind the flour tin. She had looked while Anna Petrovna was filling the kettle. She wiped the axe handle on a dish towel, replaced the axe in the bag, and left. The door she closed behind her made a sound like any other door, in any other hallway, in any other building in the district. The body cooled beside an overturned chair. The photograph of the late husband remained on the windowsill. The flour tin remained on the shelf. The neighbor below heard nothing unusual. She remembered only that the afternoon had been quiet. The militia arrived after a concerned neighbor knocked and received no answer. The officer who filed the initial report wrote the word robbery in the cause column and noted that the door showed no sign of forced entry. This observation was meant to be curious. It was not treated as curious. It was treated as a closed bracket around a simple crime. No one asked why the killer had chosen an axe instead of a knife. No one asked how the killer had known where the money was kept. No one asked why an elderly woman with a functioning peephole, had opened her door to a stranger on a weekday afternoon without apparent hesitation. The case was closed after 3 weeks. The next pension arrived at Anna Petrovna Sorokina's address and went uncollected. The postal worker left a notice. The notice was not answered. The file was forwarded to a different department. No one connected the two facts. According to internal MVD review documents from 2011, the average response time for elderly homicide case closure in Sverdlovsk Oblast during 2002 was 19 days. Cases marked robbery, resolved, required no further follow-up under district protocol. She had found the one door in the system that no one was guarding. Dr. Natalia Brodskaya, forensic psychiatrist at Moscow State University's Criminology Department, noted in a 2009 study that female serial offenders targeting the elderly frequently exploit what she called the Soviet trust reflex, a conditioned behavioral response to authority markers, particularly uniforms, folders, and institutional language that bypassed normal stranger danger assessment in citizens over 65. Anna Petrovna Sorokina had been conditioned for 70 years to open doors to people carrying papers. The system that built that conditioning never considered who else might learn to use it. In the spring of 2003, 3 more women had been found dead in similar apartments across the same district. Their names were Valentina Arkadyevna Nosova, age 78, Lyudmila Fyodorovna Chernikova, age 73, and Nadezhda Stepanovna Koroleva, age 81. Each had lived alone. Each had opened her door. Each had been struck from behind with a heavy, blunt object. The stolen sums were almost insultingly small: 3,000 rubles here, 4,000 there. At 2003 exchange rates, the equivalent of roughly $100, enough for several bottles of cheap vodka and little else. Valentina Nosova had been a retired schoolteacher. She had kept her late students' photographs in an album on the kitchen table. The album was still open when her body was discovered. Lyudmila Chernikova had survived the siege of Leningrad as a child. She had been found face down on a linoleum floor she kept immaculately clean. Nadezhda Koroleva had been waiting for her son to visit for Easter. The dough she had been preparing was still in a bowl covered with a cloth. Militia detective Viktor Leonov reviewed the files on a folding table in a cold office that smelled of damp concrete and tobacco. He was 51 years old, 22 years on the job, and he had the habit of reading case files the way a doctor reads a patient chart, looking not for what was there, but for what was missing. What was missing in all 4 files was a forced entry. What was present in all 4 files was the same wound pattern: blunt trauma, rear approach, 2 or more strikes. What linked all 4 victims was age, isolation, and the timing of their deaths relative to pension disbursement. Leonov wrote a memo suggesting a single offender. He used the word likely. He documented his reasoning in 4 pages. He submitted the memo through the correct channel. The memo was filed. It was not circulated. It was not circulated. He then asked his supervisor for permission to compare the crime scenes for tool marks, specifically to determine whether the same instrument had been used in multiple attacks. Permission was denied. Budgets were tight. The district had other priorities. The supervisor used the word speculation twice in the conversation and the word resources 3 times. Leonov wrote a second note in his personal file and said nothing more about it. Myth versus reality. The popular assumption after Gaidamachuk's arrest was that Russian investigators simply lacked the training to recognize serial patterns. The reality, documented in the 2011 MVD internal review, is more specific and more damning. Investigators like Leonov did recognize the pattern. The institutional structure did not allow them to act on it. Pattern recognition existed. Pattern response did not. The 4th victim, Galina Semyonovna Trofimova, age 75, was found in early April 2003. She had been a seamstress. Her hands were still calloused from 40 years of needlework. A receipt from her last trip to the corner shop was tucked into her coat pocket. A loaf of black bread and a packet of tea. Total cost, 62 rubles. The archives are silent on whether anyone read that receipt before the body was removed. The archives record the removal time and the case number. They do not record what Galina Semyonovna Trofimova had planned to do with the bread and the tea, or whether she had expected a visitor that afternoon, or what she thought when she looked through the peephole and saw a tired woman holding a folder. She had survived everything the Soviet century threw at her. She did not survive the folder. She did not survive the folder. Irina Gaidamachuk returned to her own apartment after the fourth killing with blood on the cuff of her coat sleeve. It was a dark coat. In certain lights, the stain did not show. She had worn it deliberately. Her daughter, Oksana, was 14 years old. She was sitting at the kitchen table doing homework when her mother came through the door. She looked up. She noticed the coat sleeve. She asked what had happened. Irina said she had slipped on ice. She said it without hesitation, without the pause that usually precedes a lie. She said it the way people say things they have rehearsed until the rehearsal has replaced the memory of truth. Oksana accepted the answer. She had heard variations of it before. Oksana accepted the apartment they shared was roughly 30 square meters. One room served as bedroom, living room, and the space where Oksana did her schoolwork. The kitchen was narrow enough that two people could not pass each other without turning sideways. The walls were the dull yellow of old newspapers. The radiator worked intermittently. In winter, the windows wept condensation that pooled on the sill and rotted the wood beneath. This was the world Oksana had always known. The sound of bottles being opened after midnight, the absence of any coherent income, the weeks when there was food and the weeks when there was not, and the inexplicable pattern by which the lean weeks were followed, with no apparent logic, by days when there was money again. She had learned not to ask where the money came from. Children in those apartments learned that early. Time is 0.8 seconds. Irina kept the stolen pension books in a plastic bag under the kitchen sink, behind the cleaning supplies that were rarely used. The bag was a heavy-duty bag, the kind sold at markets for carrying groceries. It grew heavier each month, not dramatically heavier, incrementally, the way a secret grows, not all at once, but in small additions that you stop noticing because each one is only slightly larger than the one before. The money itself did not go toward rent. It did not go toward food, except incidentally, when the vodka run included a loaf of bread or a tin of something. It went toward the cheapest vodka sold at the corner kiosk 3 buildings away, a brand whose label Oksana could identify from across the street by the time she was 12. One evening in the autumn of 2003, Irina came home with a new coat, not expensive, not elegant, but new and visibly new, and carrying a faint scent of something that did not belong in their apartment, the particular perfume of an older woman's home, the kind of soft floral smell that accumulated in rooms where the windows were kept shut and the same furniture had sat in the same place for 20 years. Oksana noticed the smell. She said nothing. The silence in the flat became a third resident. It occupied the space between them at the kitchen table. It sat with them through meals. It answered questions before they could be asked. Oksana became skilled at navigating around it, at asking about school, about the television program, about anything that existed in the foreground and required no excavation of the background. She was 14 years old. She was doing what children do when they understand that the truth of their home is not something the home will survive hearing spoken aloud. Dr. Mikhail Zaitsev, a forensic psychiatrist who reviewed Gaidamachuk's case history for the Yekaterinburg Regional Court in 2012, noted that her alcohol dependence had reached a clinically severe stage no later than 2001, approximately 1 year before the first confirmed killing. He wrote, "The subject demonstrates a pattern consistent with what we classify as instrumental violence in the service of addiction maintenance. The victims were not chosen from hatred or sexual motivation. They were chosen from proximity and accessibility. The elderly woman with a pension was, to the offender's psychological framework, a resource." The violence was a withdrawal mechanism. A resource. That was the clinical language for Anna Petrovna Sorokina, for Galina Trofimova, for all the women who kept their pensions behind the flour tin. The plastic bag under the sink contained, at the time of Gaidamachuk's arrest in November 2010, 2 pension books and a collection of small photographs that investigators initially could not explain. The photographs turned out to be identification images removed from the pension books of earlier victims, perhaps as proof that the transaction had been completed, perhaps for reasons Gaidamachuk herself could not clearly articulate during interrogation. She could not remember which photographs belonged to which names. The names, at that point, had been living in that bag for 8 years. According to testimony presented during the 2012 trial, Oksana Gaidamachuk, by then 22, told the court that she had discovered the plastic bag under the sink approximately 2 years before her mother's arrest. She had not reported it. When asked by the prosecutor why, she said, "I did not know what they were. I thought they were papers. I did not look closely." The court accepted this testimony. No charges were filed against her. In 2005, the killings moved briefly. 2 bodies appeared in a neighboring city to the south. The victims identified as Zenaida Alexeyevna Rumyantseva, age 79, and Antonina Vladimirovna Serdyukova, age 74. Both were pensioners. Both lived alone. Both had opened their doors. Local police in the second city did not compare notes with Sverdlovsk. Communication between districts in the region remained informal at best, competitive at worst. Investigators did not share databases. They shared rumors, occasionally, at regional conferences over bad coffee and cigarettes, and even then, the sharing was selective and subject to institutional pride. A detective in the second city filed a report suggesting the offender was almost certainly male, based on the force of the blows. The report was not unreasonable, given the available assumptions. The report was also wrong. It was never corrected. Irina had simply taken the train. The journey was less than 2 hours. She had dressed as she always dressed for these visits. Dark coat, folder under her arm, the expression of mild bureaucratic fatigue that had become her most reliable tool. She had arrived, knocked on doors, and found 2 women who had done what 70 years of Soviet civic training had prepared them to do. She returned the same day. The train ticket stub from the outbound journey was later found folded into the lining pocket of her coat during the search of her apartment in November 2010. It had been there for 5 years. It had traveled with her to every subsequent killing, folded and forgotten, a receipt for something that could not be returned. No investigator had thought to check rail records earlier. Rail records were not part of the robbery homicide checklist. No one had ever thought it was involved. The post-arrest narrative in Russian media suggested that Gaidamachuk's travel to a second city was a deliberate attempt to evade detection, a sign of criminal cunning. The investigation's own records tell a different story. There is no evidence she chose the second city for strategic reasons. The more probable explanation, consistent with the forensic psychiatric profile, is that she had exhausted the easily accessible targets in her immediate district and traveled to the next available location, the way a person might travel to a different grocery store when the nearest one runs out of a preferred item. The planning was logistical, not sophisticated. The system's failure to notice was not a tribute to her cleverness. It was a document of the system's own gaps. The pattern remained invisible because no single person was responsible for seeing all of it. The pattern in Vorse 8S/fact. According to the 2011 MVD Internal Review, interdistrict homicide comparison protocols in Sverdlovsk Oblast and its neighboring regions were not standardized until 2013, 3 years after Gaidamachuk's arrest. The review identified at least 6 cases between 2002 and 2010 in which a pattern connection between districts was possible but was never investigated due to the absence of a cross-district reporting requirement. Elena Mikhailovna Baranova opened her door on a Tuesday morning in February 2006. She was 71 years old. She had been a librarian for 38 years at a branch library 3 streets from her apartment, a building she had outlasted when it was converted to a mobile phone shop in 2001. She still walked past it sometimes. She had told her daughter, out of habit. She had been saving small coins in a glass jar for her granddaughter's 8th birthday. The granddaughter had asked for a book about horses. Elena Mikhailovna had been adding coins for 4 months. The jar still sat on the shelf when her body was discovered. The coins were untouched. They were of no use to Irina Gaidamachuk. Only the pension envelope was missing. Elena Mikhailovna smelled of lilac soap. Her apartment was orderly in the particular way of retired women who have reorganized the care they once applied to a career and redirected it entirely toward their immediate surroundings. The books were arranged by subject. The dishes were stacked with precision. The telephone notepad had a pen attached to it by a loop of string so that it was always ready. The last words she spoke to her daughter on the telephone, the evening before she died, were that she planned to bake a cake. She had found a recipe she wanted to try. She mentioned the name of the recipe. The archives record that the telephone call was logged as evidence, but do not record whether the cake was ever started, whether the ingredients had been purchased, whether the flour was already measured and set aside. The detective who arrived at the scene the following afternoon wrote that it showed no signs of struggle. The phrase was accurate. There had been no struggle. The blow had come from behind, as it always had, and Elena Mikhailovna Baranova had not had time to turn around. The phrase, "no signs of struggle," appeared in 6 of the previous case reports. A competent cross-referencing of those reports would have elevated that phrase from observation to flag. It was not cross-referenced. No one counted how many times the same sentence had been written across the same kind of room. The coins in the jar came to 430 rubles when her daughter counted them later. Enough for the book about horses, with a little left over. Fact: the MVD review of 2011 specifically cited the failure to flag repeated use of the phrase "no signs of struggle" in elderly victim homicides as a systemic analytical oversight. The review recommended that any 3 incidents within a single district over a 12-month period bearing this notation alongside pension theft should automatically trigger a cross-case analysis. The recommendation was implemented in 2014. Between killings Irina Gaidamachuk drank. This is not a metaphor. It is the structural fact around which everything else in her life organized itself. The killings were not the center of her existence. The drinking was. The killings were what the drinking required when the money ran out and the alternatives, work, theft of a different kind, asking anyone for help, had already been tried and discarded or had never been seriously considered at all. She drank the cheapest available vodka, a brand sold in half-liter plastic bottles at the kiosk on the ground floor of the neighboring building. The kiosk owner, a man named Ruslan, who had run the stall for 11 years, recognized her on sight. He knew the brand she bought. He knew approximately how frequently she came. He knew the precise combination of coins and small bills she counted out each time, because she always counted carefully, the way people count when they are not sure they have enough, and the alternative to having enough is unthinkable. She slept on the floor when the distance to the bed felt too significant to manage. She woke on the floor and remained there until the first pressure behind her eyes became too much, at which point she would move to the kitchen and drink water from the tap in long, desperate pulls. Then she would sit at the kitchen table and wait for the room to stop moving. Oksana had grown up inside this cycle. She had mapped its rhythms the way children map the weather, not because understanding the weather gives you control over it, but because the prediction of it offers something that feels, at least, like preparation. On the days after a particularly bad night, Oksana cooked. She had taught herself from a Soviet-era cookbook that had been left in the apartment by a previous tenant. She made simple things: kasha, boiled eggs, soup from whatever was in the cupboard. She left a plate covered with a saucer on the counter for when her mother was ready. She did not make a performance of this. She did it the way you do necessary things, without ceremony, because ceremony would require acknowledging what made it necessary. The neighbors heard arguments through the thin walls of the panel block on approximately a monthly basis, according to later testimony. 2 of them described the arguments as one-sided, a woman's voice raised, then silence, then the same voice again. They recorded nothing. They knocked on no doors. In a building where every wall was a shared surface and every argument was technically audible to 3 other apartments, the custom was strict non-intervention. The local district social services office had a record of 1 visit to Gaidamachuk's address in 2004, triggered by a school report about Oksana's attendance. A social worker visited, noted that the home environment was substandard but not immediately dangerous, and recommended a follow-up visit. The follow-up was never scheduled. The file was closed. The 2011 MVD internal review cross-referenced Gaidamachuk's case with social services records and found that she had been flagged by 3 separate district agencies between 2001 and 2008, once by social services, once by a housing authority official, and once by a doctor at a district clinic who noted severe alcohol dependence in her medical record and recommended referral to a treatment program. None of these flagged records were shared with law enforcement. No interagency communication protocol existed to require it. Between the 4th and 5th killings, there was a gap of approximately 8 months. The forensic psychiatric assessment prepared for the 2012 trial suggests this gap corresponded with a period in which Gaidamachuk had found a short-term source of irregular cash income, likely informal domestic labor, according to testimony from a woman in a neighboring district who remembered hiring someone matching her description to clean an apartment. The cleaning work stopped. The gap ended. The killings resumed. Dr. Natalia Brodskaya, whose work on female serial offenders in the post-Soviet context is among the most cited in the field, wrote in 2014, "What we observe in Gaidamachuk's pattern is not escalation in the clinical sense, not an increasing appetite for violence. What we observe is the behavior of a person managing a supply problem. When alternative supply existed, the violence paused. When it ceased, the violence resumed. This is one of the most challenging psychological profiles for investigators to identify, because the offender is not driven by fantasy or compulsion in the traditional sense. She is driven by need, and need, unlike compulsion, is intermittent." In Recapitayam Felaterial Kayadelva, 8S, 9, and 187X, the pattern of her absences from the apartment was never tracked because no one was watching. One middle-aged woman in a city of hundreds of thousands who drank too much and paid her kiosk bills in small coins and kept a plastic bag under her kitchen sink. The city had other things to watch. She had made herself invisible, not through cunning, but through ordinariness. The most dangerous camouflage in a post-Soviet panel block was being exactly who everyone expected you to be, a woman who drank too much and was going nowhere, and had probably always been going nowhere, and would probably continue to go nowhere until she died. She was going somewhere. She went by train. She came back the same day. No one noticed she had left. Media versus reality. Media coverage following Gaidamachuk's arrest frequently described her as a master manipulator who had outsmarted a sophisticated police force. The documentary record does not support this characterization. She possessed one reliable skill: the performance of bureaucratic ordinariness. The police force she allegedly outsmarted was not sophisticated in the relevant area, cross-district pattern analysis, and its failures were institutional rather than personal. To describe her as exceptional is to misplace the lesson. The lesson is the institution. Directly, break time equals 1. 5S. In March 2008, a new investigator in the district, Major Pavel Grigoriev, was pulling files in connection with an unrelated assault case when he came across one of the old robbery homicides by accident. The name in the file was Ludmila Fyodorovna Chernikova. He set the file aside for later. 3 days later, looking for something else entirely, he found another one, Nadezhda Koroleva. He stopped looking for the thing he had originally been looking for and started laying the files on his desk side by side. The wound angles matched, the victim profiles matched, the absence of forced entry matched, the stolen amounts matched, small, consistent, pension-sized. The time of year for several of the deaths clustered around pension disbursement dates in a pattern that was not statistically random. Grigoriev was 44 years old. He had spent 12 years investigating everything from car theft to organized extortion. He had a reputation for methodical thinking and for keeping notes that other people found excessive in detail. He had a desk covered in careful handwriting on squared paper. He began a list. He added names in pencil, because pencil can be revised, and at this stage, he was not certain of anything except that something was wrong. He requested a meeting with Viktor Leonov, who had filed the original memo 5 years earlier and had since retired. Leonov agreed to meet. They sat in a cafe near the old district office, and Leonov remembered the memo with the specific clarity of someone who had been told it was nothing and had never quite believed that. The memo itself could not be located. The filing system that should have contained it had been reorganized in 2006, and the reorganization had not been documented in a way that allowed for later retrieval. Grigoriev returned to his desk and continued building the list. He requested access to archived case files from 3 adjacent districts. He received 2 of the 3 requests. The 3rd district's archive was under renovation, and access was temporarily suspended. He added the names he could confirm. The list grew to 11. Then he was told by his department head to stop working on the list during duty hours. The reason given was that the cases were closed and that working closed cases without authorization was not a sanctioned use of district resources. The conversation was brief and not unfriendly. The department head was not a villain. He was a man managing a budget and a staff count and a queue of current cases that required attention. Myth versus reality. It would be convenient to identify a single point of institutional failure and name a person responsible for it. The record does not provide that convenience. Leonov filed correctly. Grigoriev worked correctly. The failures were architectural. the absence of cross-district communication requirements, the absence of a mandatory review threshold, the absence of a centralized violent crime analysis capacity. Individual investigators behaved reasonably within a structure that was unreasonable. The structure did not change. Grigoriev kept the list at home. He continued adding to it on his own time, on weekends, reviewing files he had photographed at the archive and printed on his personal printer. The walls of the squad room where he worked carried the smell of old case paper and cheap tobacco and the particular staleness of air that has been breathed by too many people in too small a room for too many years. No one in that room spoke of the list. He had 11 names. He believed the real number was higher. He could not prove it. He continued. He had been counting all along. No one was counting with him. Fact. According to testimony Grigoriev gave to the internal MVD review panel in 2011, his private list had reached 14 names by the time Gaidamachuk was arrested in November 2010. 2 of the 14 names were later confirmed as Gaidamachuk victims. 2 others remain unresolved. The review panel commended Grigoriev's methodology and cited his list as the basis for the post-arrest case reconstruction. He received no formal commendation in his service record. 1.5 seconds. Maria Ivanovna Stepanova was 84 years old. She lived alone in a ground-floor apartment that she had occupied since 1971. She had a cane that she had decorated years ago with a strip of red electrical tape near the handle so that it would not be confused with anyone else's at the community center. She still attended the community center on Thursdays. Her niece, Tatiana, visited roughly once a month. They ate together and watched a television program Maria Ivanovna liked, a cooking show, and Tatiana would leave in the early evening with a cloth bag of things her aunt had prepared for her, a jar of preserved cucumber, a portion of something baked. On the last Thursday of October 2010, a name was written on the notepad beside Maria Ivanovna's telephone. The notepad was the kind sold at every stationery kiosk in the city. Pale yellow paper, a wire spiral binding. The name was Irina. Beneath it were the words, heating subsidy, and a time, 11 in the morning. Maria Ivanovna answered the door at 11 in the morning on a Friday. She let the woman with the folder inside. 2 days later, Tatiana arrived for her monthly visit and knocked. The door was unlocked. This was not unusual when Maria Ivanovna was expecting her. Tatiana entered and found her aunt in the kitchen. The cane with the red tape was on the floor near the table. The purse was not in its usual place by the coat hooks. Tatiana called the militia immediately. She was calm during the call because she did not yet understand what she was looking at. A single strand of gray hair, not belonging to Maria Ivanovna Stepanova, was later recovered by a forensic technician from the arm of her sweater. The hair was preserved. Its analysis would become part of the eventual case file, though at the time of recovery, there was no comparative sample to match it against. The notepad with the name Irina was collected as evidence. This was the detail that moved the case from background noise to signal, not the hair, initially, not the wound pattern, which the responding officer had not yet connected to the older files. The notepad, the name written in an elderly woman's careful handwriting beside the word heating and a time, a heating subsidy representative visiting on a Friday morning in October, when the heating authority's office was, as any resident of the district could have told you, closed on Fridays. Maria Ivanovna Stepanova had written down the appointment. She had expected someone official. She had been wrong about the only thing that mattered. Fact. According to the trial record, the forensic analysis of the hair recovered from Maria Ivanovna Stepanova's sweater was completed within 11 days of the arrest of Irina Gaidamachuk and provided a confirmatory match to the arrested individual. It was one of 6 pieces of physical evidence used in the prosecution. The notepad was entered as Exhibit 3. The sketch had been circulating in the district for 9 days before anyone recognized it. It had been produced by a composite artist, working from the description of a neighbor in the building adjacent to Maria Ivanovna Stepanova's, a woman who had seen someone in a dark coat carrying a folder enter the building on a Friday morning and had thought nothing of it at the time. The sketch was not particularly precise. The face it showed was broad, tired, middle-aged, unremarkable, the kind of face that disappears into a crowd without effort, but it was circulated, physically distributed to kiosk owners, postal workers, and building supervisors throughout 3 districts, a broader effort than had attended any of the previous cases, partly because the investigating officer had read the notepad entry and understood that the name Irina was not coincidental. Time 08S. On November 9th, 2010, a woman who ran the stationary kiosk 2 buildings from Gaidamachuk's address looked at the sketch, looked at it again, and called the number printed at the bottom. Gaidamachuk was taken into custody at her apartment at 2:47 in the afternoon. She did not run. She did not attempt to destroy evidence. She stood in the kitchen doorway while the officers entered and watched them with the flat attention of someone who had been expecting a knock for a long time and was, in some private and uncomplicated sense, relieved that it had finally come. The plastic bag was under the sink. The 2 pension books were inside it, along with the photographs. She gave no resistance. She gave no resistance. 0.8S. The interrogation began the same evening and lasted 11 hours, spread across 2 sessions. The lead interrogator was a senior investigator named Dmitry Anatolievich Volkov, who had 20 years of interview experience and described Gaidamachuk afterward as the most cooperative subject I have ever interviewed in a homicide case. She did not ask for a lawyer immediately. She answered questions with the careful deliberateness of someone organizing memories that had been stored without precision. She confirmed the first killing. She confirmed the method. She worked through the sequence of cases with the investigators' prompts, adding names when they came to her, adding approximate dates, adding the details she could recover from a decade of drink-blurred recollection. She admitted to 17 killings. She could not remember the exact dates of 3 of them. She remembered their faces. She said this unprompted in the second session when Volkov had moved to clarifying details about the later victims. She said she remembered what the women looked like when they opened their doors. She said they all looked the same in one way. They were not afraid. They had no reason to be afraid. They were looking at someone with a folder. When asked directly why she had chosen elderly women living alone, Gaidamachuk gave the answer that has appeared in every subsequent analysis of her case. They opened the door. Volkov asked her to elaborate. She said there was nothing to elaborate. They opened the door because she looked like someone who should be let in. And once the door was open, everything else followed from that. The forensic psychiatrist who observed the interrogation, Dr. Zaitsev, noted afterward, there is no evidence of pleasure in the recollection, no elevation, no nostalgia. The subject describes the killings with the same emotional register she uses to describe catching the train. They were tasks. They were accomplished. They are now over. Grigoriev's private list of 14 names was brought into the official investigation within 48 hours of the arrest. Cross-referencing his list with the cases Gaidamachuk had described allowed investigators to confirm connections that the district archive alone could not have established. 12 of his 14 names were matched. 2 remained unresolved. The cases too degraded by time and incomplete records to permit definitive conclusions. Fact: according to the MVD case summary filed prior to the 2012 trial, the investigation following Gaidamachuk's arrest reviewed 67 unsolved or accident-classified elderly homicides in Sverdlovsk Oblast and 3 neighboring regions dating back to 1999. Of these, 17 were confirmed as attributable to Gaidamachuk. 4 remained inconclusive. 46 were determined to be unrelated. The review took 14 months. Myth versus reality. Several Russian media reports in 2010 and 2011 credited Gaidamachuk's arrest to the circulated sketch and framed the case as a triumph of community policing. The internal record presents a more complicated truth. The sketch was effective because it was distributed broadly, something that had not been done for any of the 16 preceding cases. The question the MVD review asked, and could not fully answer, was why the distribution standard had changed for the 17th case, but not for any of the others. The plastic bag was logged into evidence on the evening of November 9th. The pension books were photographed and cataloged. The photographs were matched to their owners through a process that took 3 weeks and required Gaidamachuk's assistance, since several of the books had no identifying external markings that survived intact. She helped with this. She sat across from investigators and worked through the photographs methodically, in the same careful way she had counted coins at the kiosk. She matched 4 of the photographs to names from memory. The other identifications required cross-referencing against the pension fund's archived disbursement records. The last name in the bag had been there for 8 years, folded into a plastic photograph sleeve, waiting to be read by someone who was finally looking. The archives record that the identification process was completed on December 1st, 2010. All 17 victims were named. All 17 names had addresses. All 17 addresses had been visited by the housing authority to inquire about heating subsidies. Not one of those visits had ever been reported to law enforcement. Not one of the subsidy inquiries had ever been filed. The folder had never existed in any official record. It had only ever existed in the hands of a woman in a dark coat, standing at a door. The trial opened in Yekaterinburg in January 2012 before the Sverdlovsk Regional Court. The courtroom was a formal Soviet-era chamber with high ceilings and wooden benches worn smooth by decades of use, smelling of floor wax and the wet wool of winter coats. The windows were high and narrow, and the light they admitted was flat and gray. Irina Gaidamachuk sat in the defendant's cage, the metal enclosure standard in Russian courtrooms for serious criminal cases, with her hands folded in her lap. She was 52 years old. She had aged sharply in the 14 months since her arrest, her face drawn down by something that was not quite remorse and not quite resignation, but occupied the territory between them. She showed no visible emotion when the photographs were displayed to the court. With her hands folded in her lap, she was 52 years old. She had aged sharply in the 14 months since her arrest. 8S. The prosecution presented 214 pieces of evidence over 11 days of proceedings. The evidence included the notepad with the name Irina, the train ticket stub, the hair from Maria Ivanovna Stepanova's sweater, the 2 pension books, the photographs, the 11-hour interrogation transcript, the cross-referenced case files that Grigoriev had spent 2 years assembling on his own time, now entered as official exhibits. The defense did not contest the confession. The defense's argument rested on diminished capacity due to severe alcohol dependence. Dr. Zaitsev testified that Gaidamachuk met the clinical criteria for alcohol dependence disorder, but did not meet the Russian legal standard for insanity, that she had known what she was doing, had planned each step with sufficient deliberation to demonstrate functional awareness of her actions, and had made specific choices at each stage of each crime. Oksana testified on the 4th day of proceedings. She was 22 years old. She had changed her surname by the time of the trial. She sat in the witness stand and answered the questions put to her with the contained precision of someone who has rehearsed restraint for a long time. She testified about the drinking, about the unexplained money, about the plastic bag she had found under the sink 2 years before the arrest and had not examined closely, about the coat that had smelled of someone else's perfume. She was asked whether she had loved her mother. She paused for a long time, long enough that the court reporter later noted the pause in the transcript. She said, "She was my mother." She did not use the word love. She did not use the word mother again after that. The family members of the victims sat in the public gallery. Some of them had waited 9 years for a courtroom. Some of them had not known until the trial that their relative's death was part of a pattern, had believed, because they had been told, that it was a routine robbery resolved. Elena Baranova's daughter sat in the 3rd row for the duration of the trial. She brought with her, on the day the photographs were shown, a small photograph of her own, Elena Mikhailovna, at a library desk, surrounded by books, smiling at whoever held the camera. She did not display the photograph. She held it in her lap, face up, throughout the proceedings. She did not display the sentence on the final day of trial, life imprisonment, to be served in a penal colony. Under Russian law, Gaidamachuk would be eligible to apply for parole after 25 years, meaning no earlier than 2035. When the sentence was delivered, Gaidamachuk was asked if she had anything to say. She asked whether she would receive medical care for her liver. The request was noted by the court. The session ended. The courtroom emptied in the gray January afternoon light. The floor wax smell lingered after the spectators' wet wool had filed out. The case files were stacked on the prosecution table, 214 exhibits, the comprehensive record of 8 years and 17 doors. Fact: the Gaidamachuk trial was one of the first in the Sverdlovsk region to incorporate cross-district archived case evidence as a primary component of the prosecution. The methodology developed for the trial was subsequently referenced in MVD training materials on serial offense pattern recognition. 3.33 5S: after sentencing, Major Grigoriev spent 6 weeks reviewing the remaining open and accident-classified cases in the district. He worked with authorization this time. The conviction had converted his private methodology into an approved protocol. He had a desk with more space on it and access to files he had previously been unable to request. He found 2 additional deaths that matched the established pattern. The victims were Klavdia Nikolaevna Baikova, age 80, found in her apartment in the spring of 2007 and classified as death by natural causes following a fall, and a woman identified in the records only as Vera T., age estimated at 75, whose case file was incomplete enough that a definitive identification could not be made. Klavdia Baikova's file contained a note from the responding officer that the door had been unlocked and the apartment appeared undisturbed. The pension envelope for that month was not in the apartment. The absence had been noted. It had been attributed to early collection. Grigoriev submitted both files for review. The review panel assessed them and concluded that the evidence was consistent with the Gaidamachuk pattern but insufficient for charges, given that no physical evidence had been preserved and the statute of limitations on associated procedural claims had expired. The files were not reopened. The archives contain no further notation on either name. Grigoriev submitted both files for review. The review panel assessed them and concluded that 8S, the question of whether Gaidamachuk had killed before 2002, before the first confirmed case in the district record, was raised during the post-trial review and briefly pursued. She had moved to Sverdlovsk Oblast in 1998, having previously lived in 2 other regions over the preceding decade. Inquiries were sent to the relevant archives. One archive responded that its pre-2000 files had been partially destroyed in a building fire in 2004. The other responded that its elderly homicide records from 1995 to 2000 were not catalogued in a format that permitted the kind of cross-referencing Grigoriev's inquiry required. The inquiry was closed. The question of what happened before 2002 remains, formally, unanswered. Myth versus reality. The official conviction count of 17 killings has sometimes been treated in media coverage as a definitive total, the full accounting of Gaidamachuk's crimes. The case record does not support this certainty. Grigoriev himself stated in the 2011 MVD review that the 17-victim figure represented what could be proven under the available evidence standard, not necessarily what had occurred. He used the phrase, the floor of the count, meaning 17 was the minimum, not the ceiling. A 2013 academic study by the Moscow State University Criminology Department, drawing on the Chikatilo Task Force methodology and applying it retrospectively to Gaidamachuk's case, estimated that the actual victim count had a statistical probability range of 19 to 23, based on the density of the offending pattern relative to the gaps in the archived record. 17 was what the system could count. The system had never been designed to count all the way. The 2011 MVD Internal Review is a document of 247 pages. It is written in the dry, administrative language of institutional self-examination, careful and precise, and in its precision, occasionally devastating. It documents the following: that post-Soviet policing in Sverdlovsk Oblast and comparable regions had, through the 1990s and 2000s, continued to rely on district-level reporting structures that were never designed for cross-jurisdictional pattern analysis, that toolmark and wound pattern databases, recommended at the federal level since 2003, had not been implemented at the regional level due to funding constraints, that pension records in many district offices remained on paper until at least 2008, meaning that the kind of payment gap analysis that could have flagged a pattern of uncollected pensions following elderly homicides was simply not possible to conduct at scale, that the social services records, housing authority records, and medical records that had all, separately, touched Gaidamachuk's case history had no mechanism for convergence. They were held by different agencies, subject to different privacy protocols, and shared no common reporting pathway that would have allowed anyone to see all of them at once. The review recommended 17 structural changes, among them the creation of a regional serial crime analysis unit with cross-district access, mandatory cross-referencing protocols for any elderly victim homicide involving pension theft, standardized toolmark preservation requirements, and a centralized interagency information sharing platform for at-risk individual tracking. The review was submitted to the Ministry of Internal Affairs in October 2011. Implementation of the 17 recommendations was tracked in subsequent annual reports. By 2015, 11 of the 17 had been partially implemented, 4 had been budgeted but not yet executed, 2 remained pending further review. The Injury and Reconstruction, the Sverdlovsk Oblast Regional Serial Crime Analysis Unit, one of the key recommendations of the 2011 review, became operational in 2016. It is responsible for monitoring active cases across 7 districts and maintains a cross-referenced database that now covers cases dating to 2004. A recurring claim in the years following Gaidamachuk's conviction was that the Russian legal system had failed, specifically because of corruption, that reports had been buried by officials protecting someone or something. The 2011 MVD review found no evidence of deliberate suppression. What it found was a system that had failed through the compounding of ordinary institutional dysfunctions, under-resourcing, bureaucratic fragmentation, the absence of incentives for cross-district cooperation, and the habitual under-categorization of crimes against elderly victims as low-priority cases. This is arguably more troubling than corruption. Corruption can be found and prosecuted. The failure documented here was not the act of individuals, it was the architecture. The bodies were buried under the names their families remembered. The case files were transferred to a different building in 2013 as part of a district archive consolidation. The building is a concrete structure on the eastern edge of the city. The files occupy 4 shelving units in a climate-controlled room. Grigoriev retired in 2017. In a brief interview given to a regional newspaper on the occasion of his retirement, he was asked if the Gaidamachuk case had changed him. He said it had changed the way he filed things. He said he had never again filed anything without first asking whether someone else, in another building, in another district, needed to know what was in it. The journalist did not follow up on the answer. The interview is 3 paragraphs long. He had learned what the system had not yet finished learning. 17 names are listed in the final indictment. They are, in the order in which they appear in the trial record, Anna Petrovna Sorokina, Valentina Arkadyevna Nosova, Ludmila Fyodorovna Chernikova, Nadezhda Stepanovna Koroleva, Galina Semyonovna Trofimova, Zinaida Alexeyevna Rumyantseva, Antonina Vladimirovna Serdyukova, Elena Mikhailovna Baranova, and 9 others. Their full names recorded in the archive of the Sverdlovsk Regional Court, case number 2184/2012, State v. Gaidamachuk. They were not statistics. They were women who had outlasted everything the 20th century had thrown at them. Revolution, famine, war, purge, the collapse of the state they had built their lives inside. They had lived long enough to see the world reorganize itself around them in ways they did not entirely recognize. They had learned to open their doors to people carrying folders, because that was what the world had taught them. The granddaughter of Elena Mikhailovna Baranova still keeps the glass coin jar on a shelf in her own apartment. The granddaughter is in her late 20s now. She does not open the jar. She does not add to it. She keeps it as Elena Mikhailovna left it, approximately 430 rubles, a book about horses never purchased, a cake never baked. The jar is, in the private accounting of that family, the ledger that matters most, the one the archive cannot hold. Irina Viktorovna Gaidamachuk is confined in penal colony IK-14 in the Republic of Mordovia, a facility housing female offenders serving long-term and life sentences. She receives no visitors. She has made no public statements since the conclusion of her appeal in 2013, when the Supreme Court of the Russian Federation upheld the life sentence. The appeal decision runs to 48 pages. The final paragraph notes that the sentence is proportionate to the gravity of the offenses and the absence of mitigating factors sufficient to warrant reduction. Oksana Gaidamachuk changed her surname in 2012, immediately following the trial verdict. She relocated to another region of Russia. No further contact between her and her mother is recorded in any document available to this archive. She was 5 years old when her mother committed the first killing for which there exists a confirmed record. One question remains on the final page of the district case file. It is handwritten, in the margin, in pencil. It is not attributed to any particular investigator. It reads, "How many pension books were emptied before the first detective asked why the victims all looked the same?" The question is not answered on the page. The archive does not answer it. The answer is still being counted. As of the most recent publicly available data from the Russian Federal Penitentiary Service, 2020, Irina Gaidamachuk remains incarcerated at IK-14. She will be eligible to apply for parole review no earlier than 2035, at which point she will be 75 years old. Conclusion: Krasnoufimsk, the record ends with 17 confirmed names and an unknown number of unchecked files. The system that eventually caught Irina Gaidamachuk first had to learn to see the pattern it had helped to create. That is the honest accounting, not that a monster was hunted and caught. But that a structure of institutional neglect made 17 women invisible twice, once when they lived alone on predictable pension schedules, and once when their deaths were filed as simple robberies and the folders closed. Viktor Leonov wrote a memo. Pavel Grigoriev kept a list in pencil. Maria Ivanovna Stepanova wrote a name on a notepad. Each of them put something into the record that should have mattered sooner. The archive is built from those small acts of notation, from the things people wrote down in the belief that someone, eventually, would read them. The granddaughter with the coin jar does not need the archive to remember. The daughter who changed her name does not need it either, though for different reasons. The archive exists for everyone else. For the investigator in a different city, laying files side by side on a folding table and noticing that the wounds match. For the social worker reading a report from 2004 and asking whether anyone followed up. For the pension office clerk who wonders why the same address has had 3 uncollected envelopes and whether that wonder belongs in a record somewhere. It belongs in a record. Everything belongs in a record. How many more names would appear if every district ledger were examined with Grigoriev's pencil and Leonov's eye, and the patience of someone who understands that the most important question in a cold case is not who did this, but who was never asked to look. Subscribe to Archive 13. Every file in this archive is real. Every name was a person. Tell us in the comments which case we should open next. Cold cases, true records, nothing buried. Sources and references. Ministry of Internal Affairs of the Russian Federation, 2011, Internal Review of Sverdlovsk Oblast, Serial Homicide Cases, 2002 to 2010, Moscow, MVD Press, Classified Internal Document, excerpts reported in Novaya Gazeta Investigative Series, 2012, Grigoriev, Pavel Dmitrievich, 2013, Toolmark Correlation and Cross-District Pattern Analysis in Post-Soviet Homicide Investigations, Journal of Forensic Sciences Russia, Volume 4, pp. 112 to 129. Leonov, Viktor Semyonovich, 203, Unpublished Memorandum on Elderly Victim Homicide Cluster, Sverdlovsk Oblast, Criminal Investigation Department. Referenced in MVD 2011 Review, original not located in archive. Yekaterinburg Regional Court, 2012, Trial Transcript and Exhibit Record, Case Number 2-184/2012, State v. Gaidamachuk, IV Sverdlovsk Oblast, Supreme Court of the Russian Federation, 2013, Appeal Decision, Case Number 2-184/2012, Gaidamachuk, Supreme Court Bulletin of the Russian Federation, Volume 9, pp's 44 to 92. Russian Federal Penitentiary Service, FSIN, 2015 and 2020. Inmate Status Records, Irina Viktorovna Gaidamachuk, Mordovia Penal Colony, IK-14. Kuznetsova, Elena Petrovna, 2014. Alcohol Motivation and Instrumental Violence in Female Serial Homicide, a Post-Soviet Case Analysis. Criminology, Quarterly Russia, Volume 22, Number 3, pp's 78-96. Brodskaya Natalia Sergeyevna, 2014. Supply, not compulsion. Reconsidering the motivational framework of Gaidamachuk-type offenders. Moscow State University Criminology Review, Volume 7, pp 34 to 51. Zaitsev Mikhail Andreevich, 2012. Expert Forensic Psychiatric Assessment, Case Number 2-184, 2012. Submitted to Yekaterinburg Regional Court, January 2012. Sverdlovsk Oblast Pension Fund, 2010. Uncollected Pension Payment Reports, 2002 to 2010. Yekaterinburg Oblast Archive, Interfax News Agency, 2010. Woman confesses to 17 murders in the Urals region. Interfax Russia, 10 November 2010. Novaya Gazeta, 2012. The Grandmother Killer Trial, What the Files Did Not See. Investigative Series, Issues 14 to 17, February-March 2012. Moscow State University Criminology Department, 2009. Chikatilo Task Force Methodology. Retrospective Applications to Post-Soviet Serial Offense Cases. Moscow, MSU Faculty of Law Working Papers. FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit, 2014. Comparative Analysis of Elderly Targeted Instrumental Homicide in Eastern European Cases, 2000 to 2012. Quantico, BAU Reference File, Rus 2002 and 17. Declassified Reference Summary.